Hello, this will be part two in this particular series, and part one was focusing on the Elizabethan era, and here we're going to have a look at King James I, who came directly after her. But so we have Queen Elizabeth, and just as a review, so we had Edmund, Gunter, John Dee, and Francis Drake, and how especially John Dee and Francis Drake were, it's not at all really argued that they had at least some Rosicrucian, let's just say, esoteric connection to earlier periods, but also, well, the concept, especially in regards to the development of weights and measures and the foot, and well, the weights that we know now are pretty much written in stone by this particular time. So you have all these different variations before, but in the Elizabethan period we really have it locked down. And we also have especially tools of navigation, measuring distance, so connect, whether it's measuring land from sea, from the ship, so to make maps, all these types of things, and how these all connect into one another. But at this particular point in time, with the Queen Elizabeth I, we really have it nailed down to the ground at this point. And so the really important figure, I believe, in this period, and the least known of those in the sphere around Queen Elizabeth I, was Edmund Gunter, and especially for his development of certain tools, but especially the Gunter's chain, or the surveyor's chain. So if you live in Australia, Canada, or America, New Zealand, you might not have heard of the surveyor's chain or Gunter's chain, but probably if you measure the width of your street or the size of your blocks, or even the blocks of land, or the street blocks themselves, you'll find that it's measured in chain, and it's a repeated theme that in previous episodes, previous series of shown that's been repeated across the world up until the modern time. But now we want to have a look at Sir Francis Bacon, because he was not high up in Queen Elizabeth's court, but with her death we really saw the importance of him as an individual really on the rise. And so he might have been on the periphery during Queen Elizabeth's time, but he was, well, basically a contemporary of John Dee, Francis Drake, and Edmund Gunter. And one of them quotes, "There are two ways of spreading light: to be the candle or the mirror that reflects it." And well, this is an important part, because not only does he have connections to Rosicrucianism, but he's also very important in the development of modern science. We'll have a look at that soon. But so 1603, Queen Elizabeth died, and King James I became the king. Now, he was King James IV of Scotland, but King James I of England, so I'm just going to refer to him as King James I. But again, just to repeat it, so in the first episode I mentioned the importance of the scepter and orb and how that connects, and so we see Queen Elizabeth with scepter and orb, and now King James I, and this being from ancient times an important symbol, because the king or the queen is the only one with the power to decide the weights and measures of the realm. So what's a foot, what's a pound, all these types of things. And it's not just in regards to local trade, it's to do with tax. It's basically the language and custom make a culture, but weights and measures makes a civilization or an empire. And so the importance of this cannot be underestimated. And so through primarily Queen Elizabeth I, we see the imperial system of measures as we know now, but there are some important developments around that period of King James I, especially in connection to King James, the King James Bible. So under King James I, Sir Francis Bacon, as you will be called, his position within the royal court rose, and he became much more important. But he's a few sort of good quotes in regards to Sir Francis Bacon. Truth will sooner come out of error than confusion, and it has got to do with his philosophy, and especially his contribution to the modern sciences, and we'll look at that shortly. The divisions of science are not like different lines that meet in one angle, but rather like branches of trees that join in one trunk, which is a good indicator as regards to the quadrivium, how these things all fold together. They're not separate lines, but the Hermetic philosophy, as above, so below, and the seven liberal arts, especially the quadrivium, that they all merge together, that they have a common source, and that they're all joined together. And this is a very important point throughout the videos I make, and especially in regards to Francis Bacon. Now, on one of his works, we see again the rose, which is essentially the symbol of Rosicrucianism, the rosy cross, the rose croix, and we'll see some other emblems and connections to there. But so of the modern Rosicrucians, now I forget the name of the city in England, but they have one of their lodges there. It's even called the Sir Francis, Francis Bacon Lodge. He's just like with John Dee or Francis Drake, the influence of Rosicrucian in their life and in their sphere might be debated, but just like Francis Bacon, it cannot be disputed that it was part of their makeup. And here are some title pages basically from some of the works connected with by or written for posthumously for Francis Bacon, and we're going to see the same symbols which will later emerge in Freemason tracing boards, Oddfellows, and these type of groups. But the sun and the moon being important. Now we also have the earth there, and even the triangle there on the bottom of the two pillars, and the obelisks, which also serve as sundials. Here we see another one, and this is relevant because we see the quadrant, which is used for navigation and for basically working out what the time is, so you can work out your longitude, and also the astrolabe, which is another important tool in regards to how it connects to time and navigation, and these very important points, because we're in the age of navigation, and we're entering the colonial. The Earth is being mapped, and we have a massive, quick growth in all sciences connected to trade, shipping, map making, these types of things. Another piece written posthumously, I believe this one was, but again the twin pillars, the canthus leaves you might notice on the columns, but tetragrammaton, which is an important Kabbalist theme, and again one that's repeated in Freemason tracing boards and so forth. Interesting thing in regards to Francis Bacon is also that some believe that he was the author of some, or if not most, or maybe not all of the works attributed to William Shakespeare. But the really important thing about Sir Francis Bacon, he was one of the fathers of empiricism, or the scientific method, observation, experimentation, and being able to test a certain theory. So the scientific theory, empiricism, which is weights and measures, and about how through observation, through measuring and weighing things and taking observations, we can establish patterns, and that these patterns will form a theory, which will therefore predict the future, which is a difference between a conjecture and a theory. A theory is something which will work very well to predict things. Now, empiricism emerged out of rationalism. Rationalism was more about using logic and reason, as where empiricism was more, well, no, let's measure it, let's make repeated measurements over time and see how this works out. Now, empiricism and rationalism are just two schools of philosophy, but all schools of philosophy basically share one thing, and that they're searching for truth through one method or another. And you can there are shards of truth in all of them, and they all work to some degree, except for postmodernism and postmodernism. Postmodernist art, they were able to sell crap in a can and call it art. Now, postmodernism has a theory, basically, is that everything is a power, especially through Foucault. Everything is a power relationship. All truth is relative. Postmodernism, the pictures tell it. And so, for instance, if you look, so it's not just about a philosophy, but all philosophies usually have an architectural and an artistic school which will grow from them. So, for instance, you see postmodernist versus neoclassical art. Now, art is what you like. There is no, but as a pure philosophy, postmodernism is cancer, because there is no truth, there is no meaning, there is no certainty. Everything is a social construct. All truth is relative. All ideas are equal, unless of course you don't agree with postmodernist fashions of the moment, in which case you're an oppressive, fascist, sexist, etc. As it's so dangerous. Now, I know it's a little bit off topic, but it is also sort of on topic, because this is a difference between the Hermetic philosophy and pretty much every other school of philosophy, as opposed to postmodernism, which is really on the rise and is basically the cause for so much of the toxicity in certain social movements at the moment. And I was going to show you some clips as an example of what postmodernism is about. It's about as unscientific. It is unscientific. By definition, it is unscientific. And I'll show some clips just to give you an example of what I mean by that.
The feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray is another who is given whole chapter treatment by Sokal and Breitmore. In a passage reminiscent of a notorious feminist description of Newton's Principia as a rape manual. Newton's Principia is a rape manual. Irigaray argues that E equals mc squared is a sexed equation. Why? Because it privileges the speed of light. Privileges is one of their favorite words, I dare say you've noticed. It privileges the speed of light over other speeds that are vitally necessary to it. Just as typical of the school of thought under examination is Irigaray's thesis on fluid mechanics. Fluids, you see, have been unfairly neglected. Masculine physics privileges rigid, solid things. Her American expositor, Catherine Hales, made the mistake of re-expressing Irigaray's thoughts in comparatively clear language.
Responses, and then we'll take the next round.
Okay, so can I respond to your submissions, because I wanted to directly respond. I was actually thinking about this coming here because I thought that it was going to be one of the coming questions. How do we even start to decolonize science? Because science is true because it is science, and what can you do? And my response to that was, if I personally were committed to enforcing decolonization, science as a whole is a product of Western modernity, and the whole thing should be scratched off, especially in Africa. So if you want practical solutions to how to decolonize science, we'd have to restart science from, an African perspective, from our perspective of how we've experienced science. For instance, I had a question for all the science people.
Writing in your diary that freedom is the freedom to say 2 and 2 make 4.
Yes.
How many fingers am I holding up, Winston?
4.
And if the party says it is not 4 but 5, then how many?
4.
1/8. How many? 1/9. How many fingers, Winston?
4. 5. 4. Anything you like. Only stop the pain. Stop.
Winston.
How can I help seeing what's in front of my face? 2 and 2 make 4.
Sometimes they're 5, sometimes 3, or all of them at once. You must try harder.
So whether it's the empirical school, the rationalists, the modernists, basically any other school of philosophy, they have some certain connections and some value, except for, of course, postmodernism, because it's cancer. Sir Francis Bacon, now back to the main point, and this being Sir Francis Bacon, empiricism and this development. So pretty much he's one of the founders of modern science as we know, and that's why you can literally trace this period in history, the Elizabethan and then King James I, and you see this explosion in knowledge gathering, and especially in the last few last 4 or 5 centuries, it's just been a massive growth in knowledge and understanding, as opposed to pretty much any other period in history that we know of, at least. But so Queen Elizabeth I, she died 1603. King James I of England was coronated, and Sir Francis Bacon now saw his rise of influence within the royal court as well. Also connections to the Royal Mile in Scotland, which connects to Egyptian Royal Miles, but that's I should have included that, but anyway, that's something else worth mentioning. But an important point in regards to Francis Bacon and the King James Bible was that he, amongst other people, but there are connections, well, he was like edited the translation. So you see the King James Bible and also the Bible now first being printed in English as opposed to being strictly in Latin or some arcane language that only the learned or the priest could understand. So it's also the development of a bit of a social movement in regards to making this thing accessible to everyone rather opposed to the select few. First page, one of the early depictions, earliest Bibles there, you see now the Tetragrammaton. Again, this will be repeated constantly, and that there's a seal from the University of Columbia in New York. The concept of sun and moon, even the dove as well. Now, I've done some videos in regards to that, but sun and moon compared to as a standard recently modern tracing board, and from the recently modern, I mean in the last 250 years. The lamb being another one, and so Freemason Oddfellow symbols is a part Greco-Roman, but they're also very much extracted from biblical symbolism. Another one that I featured in the previous episode was the pelican feeding her young, and again this being a very Masonic symbol, and also the horned Moses. Now you will find it elsewhere, but there is a strong connection that this depiction of Moses is almost always the horned Moses in regards to when it's depicted in again Oddfellows, Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and these particular type of groups. Now, the next important connection to Sir Francis Bacon, King James I, the King James Bible, is through New Jerusalem, or the Holy City. This is a theme that through previous videos in regards to modern architecture, but also the great cathedrals and even older temples, is a recurring one, especially through weights and well, especially through measurements. Now, even the description of the preserver of life, or Ark of Utnapishtim, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Sumerian times, by the measures, by the weights, by the volumes, it all ties in together. Now, I'll try to remember to put the links in the description to this, because especially stories regarding the Great Flood and how they connect to New Jerusalem, I think is very profound. But we have the King James Bible, by King James, and Sir Francis Bacon being one of those involved in the translating and or at least the editing. Exactly who did what's a little bit iffy, but the Masonic Bible are basically King James versions of the Bible, and they themselves they'll encode this knowledge, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So especially in regards to New Jerusalem. Now, your standard, like the international standard, I think it's called, will describe the walls of New Jerusalem. The height, the length, and the depth of New Jerusalem is 12,000 stadia. But in the King James version of the Bible, they describe it as 12,000 furlongs. Now, that's very important because only a short time before, Edmund Gunter had invented the Gunter's chain of 66 feet. And 660 feet is 1 furlong, so 10 Gunter's chain is 1 furlong. And so now we have, unlike the stadia, which is a bit iffy, we now have a solid to the millimetre measurement. Furlongs have fallen out of use, but one of the few places you'll still hear it talked about is in horse racing. So if you've ever heard of horses at furlong, that's what it is. It's 10 Gunter's chain, or 660 feet. So we have the older versions of the Bible describing stadia, this older Greco-Roman measure, stadia as in stadium. But now we have New Jerusalem King James Version, and they're very specific in regards to the measure 12,000 furlongs. Now, even the description of the walls as being 144 cubits or 216 feet, very important. But if New Jerusalem was literally a city, it would be out in space. It's 1,500 miles, 12,000 furlongs, so it's 1,500 miles high. So they're not literally describing a city, they're describing something else. And for this, we need to revisit part 1, quick look at Queen Elizabeth I and the definition of the mile, 5,280 feet or 1760 yards. Now the interesting thing is, if you go into your conversion tool and you type in 12,000 furlong or 792 and 40 feet, you'll get exactly 2414016 meters. It's a perfect conversion point between the imperial and the meters. Now you might think this is of the strictly modern meter that we're using now, which is a very important point because there have been slight variations in the meter. But a 1 meter long pendulum swung between 30 degrees will give you a 1 second pendulum. That's literally the definition of the second is the meter. But also that 30 degrees of that arc is pi over 6 radian or pi over 6 meters, which is exactly 1 Egyptian royal cubit, which is another very important connection into the antiquity, the history of where the meter emerged. Now, what is New Jerusalem? Well, it's not literally a city because it would be out in space. It would set probably Earth off its wobble. What it is it's like the Salamis stone, or as we'll see in a moment, the capstone found at the Red Pyramid in Egypt. It's a conversion tool. It's at a point where several systems of measure converge on not just whole numbers but beautiful whole numbers. So 792, 528. Even for Ionic and Doric at 33 and 99. Multiple sets of measures at beautiful points which form harmonic points, sun, earth, moon, stars, all these types of things. So just by chance, let's just call it just by chance, 12,000 furlong just happens to be exactly to the micromillimeter a definition of a meter. Now, most history will point the meter to 1791 and this definition based off the Earth. Other people, Metabunk hacks as well, for instance, will sort of point to 1899 and the meter prototype. They don't really understand where the meter originated, and they tend to be the people which are very vitriolic towards any imperial system of measure, because 1640, right in this period of Francis Bacon, and we'll see Robert Fludd, he defined a meter. How do you define a meter? Well, it's a pendulum of 0.994 meters. Now, he defined it at a certain point north of the equator. As you move north or south from the equator, the pendulum shifts slightly, and so the definition of a meter, or the second, or the Royal Egyptian cubit, will also depend on where you are. But was this in 1640? Well, no, because he defined it in 1640. The royal foot, I'm just in brackets to medieval royal foot, not to confuse it with others, was known to the cathedral builders. For instance, Notre Dame Cathedral is built around the royal foot. 30 and 60, which is a reflection of the description of the, King Solomon's temple. But also Beauvais Cathedral, 144 medieval royal foot. Well, New Jerusalem, 144 is one of the key numbers. You'll find it throughout the Bible as well, but how 144 connects to New Jerusalem is undoubtable. It's a very important connection. Now, speaking of navigation, well, the Greenwich Meridian. Where is Greenwich? North of the equator. Well, it's exactly the point where the French meter is exactly 86,400 seconds swing, because as you move north or south it changes. But was it from the great cathedrals? Well, it's actually earlier, because we see the Aegina foot in ancient Greece and the Mohenjo-Daro or the Indus foot from like fucking 4,500 years ago. Also has this in there, sorry for the French. But I think these are very important. Now, it's not just in ancient Greece, it's not just in the Indus, but we also will see it in ancient Egypt. Now, this might be described, firstly, the capstone here has been defiled since then. The original one has the meter encoded in it, and pi over 2 meters, which is a direct connection to the Egyptian royal cubit, and the 1 meter pendulum being pi over 6 meters. And so there you see, so that the area defined, that portion of arc, is not only pi over 6 radian, which is another way of measuring degrees, it's also pi over 6 meters, which is exactly 1 Egyptian royal cubit as defined by the Great Pyramid, 86,400 seconds per day. Now, here's the interesting part. Not only does the Great Pyramid encode the size of the Earth and the Moon, but also encodes the proportions of the Earth itself at the ratio of 86,400. You look at it from the corner. It's a three-dimensional object. I disagree with the other two-dimensional based around 432, 43,200. I believe the number is 86,400 because it's much more elegant. Now, the maximum visible base length, including the sockets of the Great Pyramid, is exactly the speed of the Earth per second. Therefore, times it by 86,400, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So around the equator. Now, but the thing is, the Earth is spheroid. It's not a perfect sphere. It's a bit flattened at the top. It's like a spinning ball. If you've seen it in slow motion, it sort of, it expands out at the in the middle. Well, if we multiply so we have the maximum visible base length, including the sockets, 86,400 to the scale of the Earth. If you multiply the height of the Great Pyramid, including the socle or the paving stones, multiply that by 86,400 seconds, we get the polar diameter of the Earth. The second is connected to the second pendulum is connected to the Royal Egyptian cubit, as defined here by the Great Pyramid. That's universally accepted, and it just so happens to connect to not just the rotational speed of the Earth, times 86,400, we get the equatorial circumference of the Earth, but we also get a description of the polar diameter or the flattening of the Earth. Now, this slight flattening is very important to navigators. This is another point. Well, for navigation, this is essential because as we get further away from the equator, the calculations change, and being able to do these is, well, very, very important, and not just for the pure science of it. To understand these things, it really can be a matter of life or death. If you can if you're making improper calculations when navigating, well, you're in really big trouble. So this is why it's so important. It's connected to the meter, to the cubit, to the Great Pyramid, size of the Earth, proportions of the Earth to the Moon as well. So, dimensions of the Great Pyramid. The stadia is 1 furlong essentially, but there are different versions of it. So, but we know with the King James Bible and with the work of Francis Bacon and others of the time that it's been defined as 12,000 furlong. We know exactly what a furlong is because Gunter's chain, only a short few decades before, that become an accepted, well, that become the measure, and 66 feet or 660 feet is 1 furlong now. So therefore 12,000 furlong is 120,000 chain. But that's interesting also because it converts to 5,280,000, 5 to 8 cubits, or 792,000 feet. But the Great Pyramid, the base of the Great Pyramid is 440 royal cubits, as we get from the pendulum and the meter and the purport, but that converts in the sacred Jewish cubits 6/5 ratio, and so we get 528 once more. Again, all these things will, cross-fertilize and come back to and bleed into one another. And of course, we jump back a few short years to the 1593, where basically the mile that we know of now was set 5,280 feet, 1760 yards. 1760 Royal Egyptian cubits is the perimeter of the Great Pyramid's base, the pure pyramid, not the socle or the sockets, and the base length of each pot is 528 Jewish cubits. So we have, again, this connection, multiple sets of weights and measures bringing us multiple sets of knowledge, but all converging around exactly the same numbers in the infinite sea of numbers, and in all this randomness, and it shouldn't happen, and it's all a coincidence, and don't look now, but here it is, weights and measures. Edmund, Gunter, Elizabethan period, bleeding into Francis Bacon. Now, 66 feet or 660 feet for 1 furlong. Either way, we get the size of the Moon in canonical cubits, the size of the Earth in ionic furlong, the size of the Earth in, ionic fathom, long fathom, the long foot, the weight of the Earth at 66,000 short tons, the speed of the Earth around the Sun at 66,000 miles per hour at its slowest point, and also, as best available knowledge, we have the solar system sort of goes up and down the ecliptic, and that's on a cycle of 66 million years, 66 feet per Gunter's chain, or 660 feet per furlong. Now, 66 feet is 792 inches. 1 furlong is 7,920 inches. 7,920 miles is the diameter of the Earth above 99.95%, I do believe. in the Ionic scale, both the sun and moon are described, and of course New Jerusalem, or the Temple of Man. Sun, earth, moon, and the Temple of Man. And just so happens that the 66 million year cycle of the solar system around the galactic core is 792,000 kilometers per hour. Oh my, it's all just a coincidence, nothing to see here. 528,000 cubits, well 528, mentioned that in previous episodes. Beautiful number, especially in regards to weights and measures, and also a description of the earth itself once more. So we're seeing the Temple of Man, music, arithmetic, weights and measures, all coming around the same point. And so, for instance, the 5,280 feet per mile, 528 being a description of the Great Pyramid as well as, of course, being a description of the base length or height or depth of New Jerusalem. So what we have here is an extraordinary symphony of beautiful coincidence all coming together, and as the standard version will go, well, it's not even the standard version, because they don't have a version in regards to this. They will not discuss this, because basically it will destroy the paradigm, the worldview that they have. Once upon a time the Inquisition used to rule, but now we have pretty much the same thing, unfortunately, where we have assumption, you make an ass out of you and me, and that's what's happened. But through centuries, millennia old systems of weights and measures, with millennia old legends such as New Jerusalem, which now it's been converted into furlong. So what is a stadia? Stadia is a difficult one because there are multiple versions and multiple periods, but at least with this particular period of Hermetic history, the Elizabethan and immediately post-Elizabethan King James I, King James Bible period, we see how we can, which is the period of the growth of navigation and so forth. Well, all these things just come together at just the right point, and all these people are Rosicrucians and this type of theme. Now, New Jerusalem as well, so 1728, 144, and again, it's how these particular sets of numbers are so important. They're so repeated. Every series I've done, every major public building, every major cathedral, all the street plans across, especially the new, like America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, as well as many other places, but just with a focus on them because there's such readily available documentation, all based around these things, all of them, every single bloody one of them. Also 108 will connect to New Jerusalem, not just the maximum visible edge length, so the most you can see at one time because it's a 3D object, but also each base is 108,000 Royal Babylonian grains. If we go back to the pendulum and that 30-degree arc, which defines the second and the royal and the meter and the Royal Egyptian cubit and 86,400 seconds per day, well, that's 108,000 seconds as well, which is the minimum, is the smallest breakdown of the compass, and 108 grains is the smallest breakdown of the Royal Babylonian scale. And earlier, previous episode, the 1 yard long cross staff of 1 yard, 108 grains in the florin. Again, this was already established before Edmund Gunter come along, and so people like Edmund Gunter, Francis Bacon, all that they've really done is solidified it and put it in an attainable form. The modern scientific world is purely built off the Hermetic and the occult. It's not they don't like to discuss it. They don't even, but the fact it's a measurable, testable, observable, scientific method fact, and it's recorded in history quite well. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to be talking Isaac Newton, but also Robert Fludd. Now, he was a contemporary, but also carried on the Rosicrucian tradition from Francis Bacon. So once more, just like with the Elizabethans, Edmund Gunter, Drake and John Dee, moving into Francis Bacon and Fludd. Now, if you notice that picture of Fludd, you'll see it again. His hands were arranged in a very unusual way, gang signs. Now, this is in art forms, again, going across centuries. And for instance, here's another few examples. If you're posing for a picture, you don't hold your fingers like that. It's very, very uncomfortable. Try it just for a minute. They're passing on symbols. So again, we see, if you notice the way his hands are posed, how his hand is posed in front of him, he's sending a signal here. Now, I don't know how to read these yet. There's a few variations on it, but there is information there. They're flashing gang signs. Gangs still do it now, and it's prison code, but it's also goes back now. There'll be a little section here. These are all artworks of Robert Fludd, or connected to him, or in his work. So, and if you'll notice, you're going to see repeated themes continually throughout there. Now, alchemy, Hermeticism is buried in alchemy, and as in the next episode, as we look a bit more at Robert Fludd and Isaac Newton, we're going to see alchemy and these geometric connections. But a very interesting, what sets Robert Fludd apart is his work, especially in regards to music. So he's definitely engaged in alchemy, or the wider schools of Hermeticism. Now, alchemy is what chemistry was before the Royal Society. So shortly after this, the formation of a Royal Society, chemistry, was separated from alchemy, but they're the same thing. All the alchemist tools, the processes they use, tincture, putrefaction, all these things it's chemistry. It's now, but the difference is with the Hermetic principle is that no one school is separate from the other. They all bleed into one another. I love this one because he's using the block and tackle. One man is lifting a huge amount of weight, mechanical advantage, well known 2,000 years at least before him. Now, astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music, these are at the core of this, but these are also blended with a wider philosophy. So the standard education scheme now, you go to maths, then you go to chemistry, then you go to your language classes or whatever, including phys ed. Well, in the Hermetic school, none of these were separate from one another. Music was chemistry or alchemy. Astronomy was music, astronomy was arithmetic was geometry, and astronomy is geometry, and so forth. And they're also blended through, philosophy and these sorts of concepts. You might notice the tetragrammaton on this picture here at the top, but this is one of the beauties of it and the importance of it, and why when the Hermetic schools really flourished, we saw an explosion of knowledge and development and civilization and all these things that we take for granted now, weights and measures, for instance. I featured previous video, again you might notice a tetragrammaton and a chained monkey. I did a video in regards to this and Hermetic philosophy and these principles about not only of truth, but of a harmonic truth, of a unified truth. So just like weights and measures at unity points where they encode systems of knowledge, these are also connected to moral learning and legends, which just blend in so well. So even if you're bad at music, you might be good at astronomy, therefore you'll be good at music and good at arithmetic and good at geometry and all these things. That's the power of it. And now there's quite a bit of, this system has been intentionally removed and intentionally suppressed. There's quite a bit of literature, especially, the skull and bones are one of the core. But anyway, so drawing right on the end of this episode, Robert Fludd, or Fludd, maybe the pronunciation, and Isaac Newton will be the, again, continuing on, literally a overlap between certain people and a certain period, and leading to this Hermetic knowledge. And Isaac Newton was a Hermeticist as well. And again, I've done a video, I'll try to put that in the description. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it maybe provoked a thought, or provoked, put something together for you that you might not have known, or encourage you to have a look into these things, whether to deny, say you don't believe or you do believe. Well, it's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of weights and measures. As above, so below. These systems are at their core scientific, and that does not make them any less magical, let's say. That actually makes them more, because they're built on the systems of nature, such as the golden ratio defining sunflowers and all these lovely beautiful things that connect. And so with that, hope you enjoyed and have a good one.